Oh, welcome people. Welcome to another episode of the 2PM Project. It's great to have your company here again. I hope you've been watching the show. I hope you've been enjoying it. We're tackling another fantastic subject here today, folks. Today we're going to look at transitions. Lots of different types of transitions. So please stick around for the next 45 minutes. We have some fantastic guests to talk about transitioning from work, transitioning to home, transitioning back again. How do we best manage it? Thankfully, we have the best minds in the business on the show this afternoon. Chris Gabardi is my name. I'm a creative director here at Interchange, and thank you for your company here again today on the 2PM Project. I hope you're having a great afternoon on Friday. This is an interactive show. I should remind you, if you have been watching, you'll know on the right-hand side of YouTube and of Facebook, we're streaming live to both platforms. You can leave your comments, and those comments will magically come back to us through the interweb to Interchange headquarters, and we'll have time at the end of the show to ask some of our special guests the questions that you want answered. Make sure that you subscribe to the show as well. There are links on our YouTube page to subscribe. Alternatively, you can go to the Interchange website, which is interchange.com.au, and follow the links to subscribe. Today on the show, transitions and how to manage them. We're going to explore some of the transitions that have resulted from COVID-19, and we're going to look at how to best manage them back. It's a fascinating time we're in at the moment. On today's show, as always, I'm joined by one of my Interchange colleagues, and today it is Consulting Director Dr. Melissa Giles. Melissa, welcome. Great to have you back. Look forward to having a chat with you this afternoon. We have two very special guests here today. Rachael Palmer, who is a registered psychologist and an expert on managing transitions. Rachael, welcome to the show. It's so great. Thank you for your time this afternoon. And Major General Andrew Bottrell, who is the head of Land Systems Division for the Australian Defence Force. Today we're going to be speaking with Andrew about his experience in the re-onboarding of troops as part of their return from active duty. Andrew, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's going to be fascinating to hear the thoughts of our guests today and the things we can learn from their experiences, part of what we try to do with this show every week. Our musical guest today comes from the beautiful Blue Mountains, New South Wales. It is French-born and raised singer-songwriter Julien Castagnaro. Hello, Julien. I can't wait to hear Julien play. He's a wonderful musician, plays multiple instruments, and a fantastic songwriter. We'll be cutting to Julien later in the show to hear one of his fabulous songs. So stick around for the next 45 minutes as we discuss how we go about supporting employees and how they transition back to their workplaces following this unusual period of working from home. You're watching the 2PM Project live on YouTube and Facebook. So, Melissa Giles, let's bring you in, my very first guest, Consulting Director here at Interchange. Melissa, what an unusual time. I mean, I feel like so much attention and preparation was placed in getting the workforce from the office to home, and now we've got an even larger problem about how do we bring people back. Tell us more about the next transition we're going to experience as part of COVID-19.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, I think when we reflect on the last few months, we've been through so many different transitions as a consequence of COVID-19. So many of us, as you said, have transitioned to working from home. We've also transitioned from having very active social lives to being quite socially isolated and physically removed from our friends and family. For those parents amongst us, we've transitioned to being coaches or teachers for our children as we've embarked on that homeschooling experience. So as you say, the next transition we're likely to go through, and we've seen some recent updates on that today alone, is for many of us that have been working from home, it'll be that transition returning to our workplaces. We'll also start to reintegrate back into society, being able to get together with more people. And so I guess that's our next transition as we move from our home offices back into our workplaces.
So it would seem, and I'm certainly going to be speaking with Rachael and Andrew around this area, but it would seem that we've potentially neglected this idea of transitioning back to the office. We think, oh, well, we've been in the office. We know what the office is like. We didn't know what home was like. We've worked that out, and now we're about to go back to the office. So There is so much we believe, I think, that businesses need to actually consider in this time transitioning back. How do we best manage this transition from your perspective, Melissa?
Yeah, I think as you said, I mean, when we transitioned from the office to our home offices to working from home, there was a lot that had to be done from a practical point of view around tech and making sure everyone had laptops and so forth. I think it's easy to assume that when we go back to the workplace, that there's nothing that needs to be done. It'll simply be business as usual. We're back in the offices. And I think we're underestimating that transition if we don't think about how we actively manage that for our employees. So I think there's a lot around moving back into the workplace that will be something that really needs consideration. And when we've been talking to clients about this, we've been talking to them to think about it as a way to frame it in terms of re-onboarding your employees. So if you think about how you onboard employees that are new to your organisation, you have a very structured plan. You certainly don't just pop them at their desk and hope for the best and walk away. You have a plan for them when you're onboarding them to your organisation. Equally, when someone's coming back from extended leave, if they've been off on parental leave or they've been on extended leave for illness, again, you have a very structured and considered plan in terms of reintegrating them back into the organisation. And, our recommendation and our thoughts are that, you really need to think about what this next transition will mean for people as they move from their homes back into the workplace. Yes,
indeed. The next transition. Melissa, thank you so much. Preparation is key to it, isn't it? It's going to be such an interesting time. Melissa, we'll come back to you in a second. I'm very keen to speak with Rachael Palmer, who is our next guest. So Rachel's mantra is "Good work is good for us." She spent the last 20 years working to improve organisational culture and employee engagement across the public and private sector organisations. Right now, she is a senior organisational psychologist with Transitioning Well, supporting individuals, teams and organisations to successfully navigate life's transitions. From what I understand, she's also navigated plenty of transition personally. At the age of 12, she moved from England to Australia. She's moved between several roles, including NAB, Victoria Police, and KPMG. Now she has two mums. She has two mums. Now she has two kids. Now she has two kids. She's a mum to two kids. Rachael, welcome to the 2PM Project. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to come on and chat today. Is it harder being a mum to two kids or navigating this process, do you think? Just as a question without notice.
The two together. We've said I do a lot of coaching to people commencing parental leave. And one thing that we do say is that, people try so hard to be really good at their jobs, really good to be at mums, and you can't do 200%.
Yeah.
And now it feels like being asked to do 300 or 400%. So, yeah, it's tough.
So I completely understand. I'm sure most of the mums out there can relate to that. So can you tell us, Rachael, from the work that you've been doing at Transitioning Well, from the work as an organisational psychologist, can you give us a couple of tips? What are 2 or 3 things that people could do to help with their transition as the lockdown restrictions are beginning to be relaxed?
So I think the most important thing is to plan. So with any transition, the more thought we put into it, the more that we take stock of our resilience, our resources and so on, and how we're thinking about a situation, the better the transition will be. So absolutely, take stock, plan at an individual level. When it comes to resilience, have a think about coping strategies. And I like to simplify this. I like to simplify lots of things, but coping strategies, I think, fall into emotion-based coping and problem-based coping. And a lot of the people, particularly the people I work with and I coach, are very good at problem-based coping. But we need to also not dismiss, not discount that emotion-based coping. And I think, an analogy I often use is grief, and it's a very apt analogy given everything that people are losing, and perhaps in this transition realising that won't come back. Perhaps people have been holding on to that thought that, this is a temporary loss, and they're things that will go back to normal, and they're realizing that perhaps aspects of their life are changed forever. So when we lose something, when we lose a loved one, you know, a lot of problem solving happens. We organise the funeral, we tell people, we organise, we write lists, we do all that sort of great stuff, and that needs to be done. It's absolutely necessary. But I say, you can't problem solve your way out of grief. At some stage, you have to do that emotion-based coping, and a lot of is said about mindfulness. Mindfulness isn't for everyone. People need to work out what works for them, what resonates, whether it is exercise, whether it is yoga, whether it is just taking a moment to breathe, but to find a way to process their emotions. So planning, coping strategies, and then the third thing that I think is critical in this time is knowing who your supports are. And recognising that we go to different people for different kinds of support. So we need affection, we need affirmation, and we need advice. So just take a moment to think about, well, who do I get the cuddles from? Who do I get a sense of affection, even if it's virtual and not physical right now? Who tells me that I'm doing a good job? Who can I just ring for a morale boost? And if I need some help problem solving, or I can't quite get my head around something, who do I go to for advice? So they're the three big things, I think, as we plan for a transition.
I think it's been really interesting, Rachael, in recent weeks. I was only speaking about this morning. I'm having more and more conversations with people that I know connected to not only coping strategies, but the emotion-based coping strategies that you speak of. People that I never would have expected to be having conversations, males. Let's put it that way. Let's talk it. Let's just cut all the crap. I'm talking males. I never thought I would be having emotion-based coping strategy conversations with them. People are starting to engage more and more in this, and it needs to be discussed. If I just move this conversation more towards leaders, in recent weeks we've done some shows connected to leadership. What about leaders? What should they be doing? What extra work should they be doing to help with transitioning people back to work?
So again, planning is key for leaders. They need to plan slightly differently. There is, taking stock. There's masses of logistics to plan. If you're bringing people from home back into the office, you've got all that practical stuff. But I think this is a great opportunity for leaders to really think about the kind of organisation they want to lead. I talked to some people as they transitioned into, this crisis, and they talked about how they really dug deep with their values. They didn't change their values, but they really sort of thought about, well, how do our values help us navigate what's going on here? And I think the same applies as we transition to the next phase. What about our values is so valuable here? How do we recast or re-talk about how we change, the story if we need to around our values? But also a bit of, reflection on what's worked, what's missing. Perhaps this is a time to refresh values and the aspirational culture. Perhaps there are things that, absolutely have become more critical, more important, and perhaps some things that are less relevant as the business changes and evolves. So planning, equally important for leaders. The other thing for leaders is to not make assumptions. And I can't emphasize this enough. One of the mantras, I suppose, through this pandemic has been that we're all in it together. There's almost been this sort of global connection about we're all experiencing this. And that's been lovely, and it is true, I suppose, to some extent. But people at an individual level have had very different experiences. Some people have relished being at home, loved extra time with kids, or perhaps they've continued working and it feels like not a heck of a lot has changed for them. Some people have perhaps lost loved ones either here or overseas or what have you. So I think really don't make assumptions about how people are feeling about this transition, about how they've felt over the past few weeks, about what this actually means for them. And the way to not make assumptions is obviously to listen and to really, really listen to your team members. And then the third one for leaders is really the one that I talked about for individuals. And leaders need to look after themselves in order to be able to be there for their teams. So not to neglect that self-compassion and that self-care aspect.
I'm speaking with Rachael Palmer, Senior Organisational Psychologist with Transitioning Well. Rachael, it's so interesting to hear your thoughts on this topic. One further question. You mentioned the importance of supports earlier. What can we do to support others? And we've spoken about business, but I imagine there's a great deal of support that's needed from a family perspective, friend perspective. What can we do to support others?
And I love the way you've asked that question. I mean, it's important to think about how I get the support I need, but supporting others, I mean, that's just good for our mental health in and of its own right. There's so much beautiful research showing that, showing that support to others is good for us as well as for them. I think the main thing I would pull out about supporting others is that distinction between affirmation and advice. And it's very easy when you get on the phone to someone and they're, having a bad day or pouring out a story about something that's on their mind, to just jump into that advice mode. And that's not always what people want and need. So really sort of, I guess, clue into those cues, or even just ask, do you want me to help you problem solve this? Or, just say, you're doing a great job. You've got this, I believe in you. This is tough, reflect that emotional side and give them a boost rather than trying to necessarily solve their problems for them.
Thank you, Rachael. I really appreciate your time this afternoon on the 2 p.m. project. We're going to come back to you in a minute. I'm going to speak with Major General Andrew Bottrell to hear about his lived experience of leading people through transition. So Andrew has commanded at troop, company, battalion and brigade level and has served on operations in the Antarctic, East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan. He is the Senior Defence Officer in Victoria, based at Victoria Barracks, where he is the head of Land Systems Division, responsible for the acquisition and sustainment of all land material for the Australian Defence Force. Andrew, it is a great pleasure to have you join us today on the 2 p.m. project. Thank you so much for your time. Can you talk us through some of your experiences supporting troops who are transitioning back from active service, and ideally, sort of what are some of the areas that you need to give the greatest attention to?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for the invitation. Look, can I say at the outset, Rachael, the points you made absolutely resonate with the organisation I'm with now. Most of my career has been in the Land Army, where it's an operational aspect of the Defence Force where we deploy on operations. Now I'm in an office environment with a largely public service workforce. Probably 3/4 public service, and the remaining quarter would be defence personnel and contractors. So over 50% of my workforce is over 50 years old. So it's a very different organisation than I spent the majority of my career with. Look, on the deployment side of the house, we spend a lot of time deliberately preparing to take people on operations, and we spend a lot of time with organisational psychologists before we go, when we come back, and a lot of time with clinical psychologists while we're over there, assessing the baseline of someone before they deploy and then throughout the deployment, and then deliberately looking at them as we start to transition to bring them back to Australia. And then once we come back to Australia, we deal with it on both a small group, large group, and an individual level. So we recognise that there is organisational culture that we've got to take account of, and that's where leaders play a huge role. But in every case, there's an individual level where we've got to understand what that lived experience is for that individual. And to Rachel's point, everyone is going through this slightly differently. And I've got off the back of this, we're looking at employing some of the approaches we use for operations into this environment, but having to adapt that to look at what does it mean for in this case, our families are also deployed on operations with us, so it's slightly different to what we would normally go through. So it's, there are lessons there, but a really deliberate approach to bringing people back, spending time with them, to talk through what was their experience, what did it mean to them, and of course staying in contact with them while they've been away. So 8 weeks ago, participating in this kind of activity online would have been unusual for me. I used to do brown paper bag lunches every fortnight in my office with small groups of folks from lower levels in the organisation, and now I do them virtually online to stay in touch with people. It's been really interesting to hear people's views, and that's helped shape what do we need to go through to prepare and plan for bringing them back. And to your point earlier, we've got a very clear transition plan for how do we bring our groups back into work slowly, deliberately, and then how do we leverage some of the positive aspects of what they've been through into the future as well. So definitely lessons that we can take forward as well. Hope that sort of answers some of your questions.
So earlier, both Melissa and Rachael spoke about planning. You've spoken about planning as well. Do you have understanding or knowledge of the way businesses are approaching this? Do you believe that they have got enough plans in place? What could they learn from your experience of the type of detail in the planning that you are doing?
Yeah, Chris, look, my job now is essentially the interface with the industry. So I'm spending a lot of time working with both large multinationals overseas and smaller and medium Australian entities, and they've all approached it slightly differently. Obviously, those larger multinational organisations have got huge plans, and the motivation in industry has led them to be successful, to continue to find a way to succeed and to continue to operate. The real pressure has been on some of those smaller organisations who are struggling, where cash is essential for them, and they don't necessarily have the weight of effort to be able to think about how do they plan and prepare. So it is really tough for small and medium enterprises I've seen. Not so much for the larger multinational organisations. They seem to be pretty well prepared and seem to be doing pretty well overall.
I find it hard to sort of phrase this question because I don't want to lessen anything connected to the experience that a troop may have on active duty overseas, in trying to draw a parallel between the situation that we're currently going through on a corporate level or even, just on a global level. But I just wonder, Andrew, are there any parallels that you see between the experience of what a soldier may go through in transitioning back from active service into a kind of a normal world, and what the current climate is looking like for corporate? I don't know whether I've asked that the right way.
No, Chris. Look, absolutely. People are going through a type of trauma in what they're experiencing now, and we know from operations that stress is cumulative. So the way people respond to that is very individual, and that's why we spend a lot of time looking at the impact on individuals. In a similar way, and I've got a lot of friends who are teachers. My wife is a nurse. My sister is a nurse. They are experiencing stress and emotion differently than perhaps they had a while ago. Most of my workforce are older and they've got children, and they're trying to deal with how do they assist their children through their education while they're also working remotely. In Victoria, it has been really pretty stringent on schools going back, etc. So, or not going back, as the case is. So there are definite parallels. Understanding what who hasn't coped well and what support measures we can put around them. And that's where we've stayed in touch with people. There is face-to-face through virtual means with every member of my 1,100 workforce every day, so that we can make sure that people are coping. And we've got a good sense, because who walks into the barracks on a normal day, we know that there's more to who they are. This has amplified that issue that you need to know the whole person to understand how they tick and what motivates them, and how the stresses and pressures affect how they perform their work and how they perform as an individual. So there are direct parallels, and there are things that we can learn for sure.
I'm speaking with Major General Andrew Bottrell from the Australian Defence Force. Andrew, you deal with unusual situations all the time. Stuff comes up, you have to find a way of coping with it, both personally connected through your leadership, but also with your people. Do you feel like you were all over this period? It was easy for you to navigate. What did you learn, and what do you think you could have done better?
Yeah, good question, Chris. We always spend a lot of time. We're great at analysing how we go through things. You know, we have a lessons learned program where we look, and we just went through the bushfires and the huge amount of work that we did in support of that. And literally, we're working through the lessons learned in the last few weeks on that. We have been collectively looking at the lessons we've learned from here. How did we prepare going into it? Melissa, I think huge lessons around that, and the applications to be able to support it, and the positives as well. You know, we talked a good fight about flexible workplace arrangements. You know, we only had a very small percentage of the workforce doing that. Off the back of this, I've now got lots of people who are preparing for. We were fairly early in preparing to transition people out, but we were still short on technology. You know, having a workplace in the home is tough when everyone's competing for the one or two laptops you might have, for the office space that you may not have, and when the children are trying to use the same things for entertainment. I mean, you know, they're all the issues that I struggle with and that everyone struggles with. So thinking through those are issues that you know, we need to be more deliberate if we can in the future. How do we have redundancy that we can send people away with? Now, we're better set up than many organisations because we've got a lot of that we take around the country anyway. But you know, definitely lessons that we can build upon.
Andrew Bottrell, thank you so much for joining us on the 2PM Project. I really appreciate your time this afternoon. We're going to bring our three special guests back in. Melissa, I might start with you. You've been listening attentively. I know you've always got some interesting questions to throw out. Do you have a question for Rachael?
Yeah, I do, Rachael. So obviously at Interchange, we spend a lot of time talking to organisations around culture and supporting them in terms of moving towards their aspirational culture, which was something you mentioned before. I'm really interested in your perspective around how do you see these transitions influencing on organisational culture? Let's unmute her.
I'm back.
You can't have a call without someone not me.
So whether leaders sort of think about it or not, this is going to change an organisational's culture. So, I mean, I think the bottom line is be intentional and take advantage of this situation. I mean, so much has been, you know, chucked up in the air and is up for grabs that it would be a shame just not to think about, you know, the values, about what has worked, and to reflect on that, and to sit down, you know, with the senior leaders if you're part of a senior team, for example, and to think about, you know, the ideal culture and what this could be, and do a bit of blue sky thinking around the future.
Thank you, Rachael. Melissa, how about a question for Andrew? What a fascinating perspective to get some thoughts from the Defence Force about how they approach these sorts of things. How about a question for Andrew?
Yeah, so interesting, Andrew, and thank you for sharing your experience. You've obviously managed a lot of people through transitions, both, as we said, the active service and the current situation you find yourself in. And you shared a lot about new ways of working. I guess I'm really interested to hear, what have you learnt about yourself as a leader through this process?
Gee, that's introspection is always a look. I found that I don't work well from home. I had to think really carefully about what role as a leader did I need to establish. So I deliberately went and worked from home to show that I was doing that as well. But I then realised that I felt as if we were losing some sense of stability in the organisation. So I deliberately have come into work every couple of days so that we could. I could show that, you know, the workplace is still functioning, and that I'm, you know, still here, and that this place is still the core of where we do our business. So the barracks is, you know, it's really it's a real pillar in the way we see ourselves and how we function. And so that's been quite deliberate, how I've thought about how I do that and how I engage. And so I don't work well from home. I've really enjoyed one-on-one conversations with small groups via virtual means, and we're going to be using this a lot more into the future. So there's a huge power in applications for people, keeping people connected. And it's reinforced my view that leaders at all levels need to be really connected with their workplace. And I know that sounds passé, but it's, if ever, it's been reinforced to me. And we see it on operations in a really visceral way. But here, where you can't reach out and touch someone, having to rely on your chain, whatever that is, whether it's deep or flat, your leaders at every level need to remain really well connected with your workforce.
Thank you, Andrew. There's a question that's come in on YouTube. I think it's worth throwing out to both of you, or even Melissa, if you have any thoughts on this one. Rachael, we might start with you first. Are there any key behaviours to look out for in the workplace or virtually that may indicate that someone is not coping? What are the behaviours that we might actually look out for in this situation that actually helps us support our colleagues? Oh, Rachael, the mute again. That's okay.
You're not allowed to do it twice, are you?
That's all right.
Yes, there are. And I think probably the short answer I'd give to that, rather than listing, behaviours is, your people. If you're a leader in an organisation, your people, and go with your gut. So if something just doesn't feel right, doesn't seem right, ask. You're not going to make someone's day worse by asking them how they're going, and asking them if they're really okay, and genuinely listening to the answer. So even if you've picked it wrong, even if they're absolutely fine, you're not going to do any damage by asking. So just go with your gut and ask.
Andrew, I can see you nodding there on one of the other cameras here. You're obviously in fierce agreement of what Rachael was saying. Do you have any thoughts on that? What are the behaviours that you might be able to see in people?
Look, a sort of general malaise or general sense of depression that people get, and exactly as Rachael said, having the conversation, asking them if they're okay, how are you coping with it, and teasing out, what are the pressures. So in some cases, we've deliberately brought a couple of people back in for 1 or 2 days a week, just to give them a change of their environment, and to be able to generate some variety. But it's clear, because our leaders do know their people when they are and aren't coping. And it is as simple as that. And that's why staying connected with them is really, really essential.
It's a wonderfully simple and positive approach to take. Thank you so much. Melissa, do you have any thoughts on that? Any key behaviours that you could look out for in the workplace that may indicate that someone's not coping?
I think it's such a good question, and one of the silver linings of COVID-19 is that we have been talking about our mental health more. And you said at the beginning of this, Chris, like, we're having conversations, we're actually saying to people, how are you going? What's it like for you at the moment? And Rachael made the point before, we know that people are having really varied experiences from COVID-19. Some people are loving being at home. Some people are loving only going shopping once a week. There's some people that are loving it. There's other people that are finding it really challenging. So I think it's really important that we continue that behaviour, because one of the most powerful things you can do is to say to someone, are you okay? We know that. And as Rachael said, if they are okay, they're going to go, yeah, I'm okay. But if they're not okay, they've got that opportunity to express, no, actually, I'm really struggling at the moment. No, I'm not travelling well. So for me, as a psychologist, I love that this is something that's become more commonplace. Over the last few weeks, I've had more conversations about mental health than I've had in my entire career, because we're able to say, no, actually, I'm really struggling. And that support network, to be able to put that in place, to actually know who you can ring and say, gee, I'm having a really tough day, and to talk that through. So I think, knowing your people, having those conversations, asking, are you okay? They're all so incredibly important.
It's been a wonderful conversation this afternoon. Thank you so much to all of our guests. We're going to come back to you in a second. I'm going to bring in our musical guest. I think it's the perfect time to bring in some beautiful music. Julien Castagnaro, better known as Julien Joel Clement, coming to us from the Upper Mountains in the Blue Mountains, New South Wales. So Julien was born and raised in the French countryside north of Paris. He emigrated to Australia's Blue Mountains in 2003 and quickly established himself as a regular on the music circuit there after years of forming and joining bands of various styles, including funk, Balkan, disco, ska, jazz, playing cafes, bars, small venues. Julien recorded his debut solo album, Failure and Masterpiece, which was released in 2018. During the isolation from COVID-19, he started working on a second album, which is wonderful. Can't wait to hear that, preparing the ground for touring abroad. Julien Joel Clement, or Julien Castagnaro. How does a Frenchman have an Italian surname? What happened there?
It's Europe, man. You have an Italian surname.
That's true. And we worked this out.
The borders are porous.
Sorry?
The borders are porous. You can move.
That's right. Yes, the good people are welcome anywhere. Come on into France, whatever. Just make some pasta.
Very true.
Yeah. Julien, you still have family in France, obviously. How have they been coping through this period? France has been a particularly hard place to be. How are they doing?
Yeah, well, I think it's been harder than here in a way. A lot more people, so they've really had to be strict about it. There's been the police. There's been a lot of police force finding people if they don't have a reasonable excuse to be out. So people have to think about why they go out and what they can do out there. It's also, well, like here, teaching the kids again, not being able to go out as much as we have here has been a tricky part physically for people. They can't, walking the dogs, there's only so many times you can do that. And they're really keen to get out, especially it's springtime now. The weather's getting good. Everyone's really keen to go. But it's not over. I mean, France alone has, 65 million people? So, yeah.
And how about you, my friend? I mean, I know the Blue Mountains has been pretty hard hit. A place that relies so much on tourism. The fires came through and destroyed, from my understanding, almost 80% of the Blue Mountains. I know you to be a prolific live musician. You play all the time. You're always writing songs. How has it been in the area, and how has it been for you in recent weeks and months?
Yeah, there's been a strange summer, Chris. The fires, we've already lost, gigs from there because obviously people couldn't come that much to the Blue Mountains, so there was a decrease. Then we had the floods. Then all artists, musicians have lost, all their jobs, obviously, and it's been really hard because, I mean, especially for me as a musician, like every weekend I play, and I'm looking forward to, connecting with people and vibing off an audience and seeing people dance depending on the music. And suddenly that's all gone. And there's only so much guitar playing I can do at home. So come the weekend, I get cabin fever, and it's all summer. So that's 5 months now nearly of this. It's strange.
It's very hard to hear, but I understand here you're preparing for your second album, for touring again, getting ready. I always like to ask this of the musical acts that come on. Some people feel very creative in this time and are using this time. They're just grabbing it and writing thousands of symphonies. Others, and I think probably the majority, are saying, I don't feel particularly creative. How creative do you feel?
Well, at first I didn't because, as Rachel was talking about this grieving period, suddenly you've lost the gigs and you've lost raison d'être, as we say. And it was like, I'm useless, I'm pointless. And creativity went just somewhere else, on Netflix somewhere. On the screen on YouTube. So and eventually, my lifestyle pretty much didn't change except for the weekends, and there's no rehearsals in the week. But bit by bit, people, learning to connect on Facebook in a different way, in a way that matters more than before, I think. Doing live on Facebook has been a big help for me, because then I can play songs and get a few reactions. And it started coming back slowly, going, okay, this is how we're operating for now. Let's roll with it. And I've had quite a few interactions I wouldn't have necessarily at live gigs, actually. I mean, just you asking me to do this today, it's something I wouldn't have had from a gig, I think. So there's been some really good things to come out of it. So the creativity went down, and then it's slowly, coming back up. I'm using this time to go on my second album, to go for it.
Well, that's very good to hear. I'm speaking with Julien Castagnaro, also known, you may know him better as Julien Joel Clement. And Julien, it's a great thrill to have you play for us today. Can you tell us a little bit about the song you're going to play, and then you can just launch into it?
Yeah, well, the song is, I'm a very literal person. I've called the song What I Do for a Living, which I wrote, I forget when. I used to work in tourism. I did for 12 years, and then I was thinking about stopping. My partner said, why don't you just do music? And it was a big shock for me. It took me months to kind of go, I'm still, worthy if I don't have a full-time casual job. So I wrote the song about this, and it's a reflection about self-worth, and not really knowing where we're going, but focusing on the moment, and I think it could resonate with what we're going through now. It's a transition song in a way.
Fantastic. Thank you. I can't wait to hear it. Pleasure.
I'll go out a bit. Well, might be a bit loud. Okay. And this is going to be on the second album. Device in my hand that I don't fully understand. Do I need to? Oh, it's telling me this big story that we're all connected and lonely. Hey, I love you. I've been feeling this guilt for doing nothing in music, though I do love to. I used to have the rich get richer and believed I was a far better person when I used to. Oh, I used to work 5 or 6 days a week. Never felt strong. Working for the future like now, it doesn't exist. It's always felt wrong. They say bye, I'll own it, and then lend me the money for it. I don't know. They say I need to settle down somewhere, but I settle for settling anywhere we go. Oh, what do I do for a living? Mostly I try not to be dying, just like you. I'm pretty much set for life with this job, unlike the one I was regularly being paid for when I used to. Oh, I used to work 5 or 6 days a week. Never felt strong. Working for the future like now, it doesn't exist. It's always felt wrong. Oh, wrong, yeah. Okay. La, 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 la. La, la, la. Understand, do I need to? Yeah, it's telling me this big story. We're all connected and lonely. Yeah, I love you. Oh, I love you for urging me to do this beyond right and wrong. Working for now like nothing else exists. To always feel strong. Hey, hey, yeah. Woo. Oh, la, 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 la. La, 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 la.
Fantastic fella. That's Julien, Joel, Clement playing for us from the Blue Mountains. What a great joy. Thank you, my friend. So fantastic to have you as part of the 2 p.m. project this afternoon.
And
I wish
also
you all the
listening to you
best.
guys.
And yeah, I hope we can be in a room together to hear that fantastic
please.
voice of yours. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
We're going to come back to our guests as we finish off for the show. Just final thoughts from our guests. Melissa Giles. Oh, there's that mystery mute button again. Hey? Okay,
Julien's
2-1.
bad today. I'll blame Rachael for that.
Okay.
Yes. So it's been a great episode today, and I've learnt a lot from my fellow guest speakers today. I think my takeaway message is don't assume transitions will take care of themselves. Start planning. Think about what's next and get a plan in place.
Fantastic. Thank you. Rachael Palmer.
I think the message I'd like to reinforce is that around values. We talked about values being important for leaders, but also for families and for individuals. So take this opportunity, think about what's important to you, your family, and use that as your reference point as you move forward.
Thank you. Finally, Andrew Bottrell.
Yeah, Chris, look, I'd reinforce the point that people will have experienced or may well have experienced a sense of trauma and stress throughout the last 6 weeks to 8 weeks. You need to identify that and you need to treat it, and absolutely endorse the points by Melissa and Rachael as well. Plan deliberately for a return, and then deal with it when people come back to work as well.
Thank you to our special guests here today on the 2 p.m. project. Rachael Palmer, Senior Organisational Psychologist with Transitioning Well. Thank you so much for your time today, Rachael. It was great to hear your thoughts. Major General Andrew Bottrell, Head of Land Systems Division at the Australian Defence Force. Andrew, it was a great pleasure to have you on the show this afternoon. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you to our house band today, all the way from the Blue Mountains. Katoomba calling, Julien Castagnaro, also known as Julien, Joel, Clement. We will be putting links to Julien's music in our description once this stream is up on YouTube permanently. And thank you also to my Interchange colleague, Dr. Melissa Giles. Thank you, Melissa. As always, it's fantastic to hear your thoughts on these sorts of things. We'll see you next week. Finally, my great thanks to the show's producer, Double Leopard, Emma Grace. 1.5 metres away, please. Did you see something pass behind here? I don't know. Anyway, something definitely went past, but we're keeping our distance. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the 2 p.m. project, please. Ooh, Emma's trashing the place. I think it's gone to her head, this front of camera business. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the 2 p.m. project. Please make sure that you subscribe. Go to our website, interchange.com.au, and we will send you a link in your inbox every week. We can also customize this show as we are doing for other businesses, where we can produce this show for your people, with your guests, and particularly your musical artists. Chris Gabardi is my name. Thanks so much for your company here today. Happy Mother's Day to all the mums out there. You really deserve a nice lunch and a boozy afternoon on Sunday. Looking forward to seeing you for another episode of the 2 p.m. project next week. In the meantime, please stay safe. I really mean that. Take care.